Hi all, hope you're staying safe and well. Today we're going to be having a look at the poem The Farmer's Bride by Charlotte Mew. This is a really interesting one in the anthology because there's a lot of interesting context and background to the poem, and looking at the role of gender in society, in particular Victorian society, is really interesting within this. The poet Charlotte Mew never married and there've been assumptions made that she was homosexual, and her interpretation of what a male-female relationship was like at the time, or how an oppressive male-female relationship can be presented, is a really interesting perspective to have a look at. So I hope this video is really useful, just running down some of the core themes and ideas of The Farmer's Bride. And obviously bear that in mind in the context that the poet is a female writer, creating this narrative to try and highlight the hypocrisies and the possessive and constrictive nature of relationships in Victorian society. Okay, so where can we begin with a poem like The Farmer's Bride? Well, initially we've got to consider the context and the historical context of the time period in which Charlotte Mew was writing. We talk about a time of great gender inequality, and therefore relationships they certainly weren't always built on romanticism. They weren't built on the idea of a romantic pairing. Some of them were built for convenience. A lot of them were built to tie in alliances like family alliances or wealth or status. So often marriages weren't necessarily paired in a romantic manner. And the relationship that's presented in The Farmer's Bride is very much one like this. We have a farmer who is narrating the poem, and he's been married for 3 years, and his wife is terrified of him. His wife is now refusing to accept his advances or to see him in a romantic manner, and he can't understand why, despite the evidence that's in front of him in the way he narrates this poem. So we'll read the poem first, and then we'll have a look at those 5 strands of meaning, imagery, tone, structure, and language of the poem. So here we go. 3 summers since I chose a maid, too young maybe, but more's to do at harvest time than bide and woo. When us was wed she turned afraid of love and me and all things human. Like the shut of a winter's day, her smile went out, and 'twasn't a woman, more like a little frightened fay. One night in the fall she runned away. Out 'mong the sheep her be, they said, should properly have been a bed, but sure enough she wasn't there, lying awake with her wide brown stare. So over the 7-acre field and up along and across the down we chased her, flying like a hare, before our lanterns to church town, all in a shiver and a scare. We caught her, fetched her home at last, and turned the key upon her fast. She does the work about the house as well as most, but like a mouse, happy enough to chat and play with birds and rabbits and such as they, so long as menfolk keep away. Not near her eyes beseech, when one of us comes within reach. The women say that beasts in stall look round like children at her call. I've hardly heard her speak at all. Shy as a leveret, swift as he, straight and slight as a young larch tree, sweet as the first wild violet she, to her wild self. But what to me? The short days shorten and the oaks are brown, the blue smoke rises in the low grey sky, one leaf in the still air falls slowly down, a magpie's spotted feathers lie, on the black earth spread white with rime, the berries redden up at Christmas time. What's Christmas time without there be some other in the house than we? She sleeps up in the attic there, alone, poor maid. 'Tis but a stair betwixt us. Oh my God, the down, the soft young down of her, the brown of her, her eyes, her hair, her hair. So the meaning of the poem is to explore this relationship between men and women, looking in particular at the way that male dominance and power in the society in which Charlotte Mew was writing can be used to dominate and to suppress and oppress women in that society. So the poem takes the form of a monologue by the farmer, and he describes his bride as fearful, as frightened, and as dismissive of men. And he describes in particular an incident of where in the middle of the night, she chooses to run away and flees across the fields. And he and the other men of the town chase her with lanterns and dogs, and they hunt her down like an animal. And then when she returns to the farm, they lock her away and they lock her up and they turn the lock fast. Now, obviously, that's a traumatic experience. And then the rest of the poem is the farmer lamenting how he can't understand why she has no affection towards him, and how she is very passionate about animals and is very gentle, and other people, specifically other women, compliment how gentle and caring and kind and considerate she is. But whenever men come within reach of her, her eyes scream and beseech, not near, not near. She's terrified of men. At the very end of the poem, the farmer laments that the house feels empty, and that at Christmas time, when the berries start to redden, which is a metaphor in itself, that he longs to have children and he longs for someone else to be in the house. But obviously the separation between him and his wife is too deep and too vast for that to happen. At the end of the poem, we have this lament, where the poem almost breaks down. The narrator of the poem almost breaks down and beseeches like her hair, the brown of her hair, and the poem ends with the bride sleeping in the loft and a staircase separating the two of them, with this emotional distance between them as well. So it's really quite a deep and interesting poem to have a look at, and it explores in depth the ignorance of some male characters at that time, who didn't understand the fears and the worries and the inequality of women at that time. And the farmer's bride, who is never named, this is quite an important point, that she never has a name revealed to us. She's merely the property of the farmer, is a terrified young girl who has been taken from a family and for 3 summers has had to live this horrific life. So a lot of really interesting ideas there, and as we sort of scratch beneath the surface, there's a lot deeper contextual links that we can make as well. With The Farmer's Bride, there's lots of really interesting imagery that we can use and we can explore in a fair amount of depth. The narrator of the poem is very vivid in his descriptions about his relationship with his wife and how he describes what she is like. He uses a lot of imagery to describe her as beautiful, for instance, and he goes into great depth to describe the incident where she's chased across the fields. So we're going to take it stanza by stanza and have a look at a few images in there. So in stanza 1, we have the idea of 3 summers since I chose a maid, the implication being that the farmer's bride had no choice in this, the fact that he chose her and she became his partner. There was no sort of questions about it. He says, more's to do at harvest time than bide and woo. So he sees the harvest as his priority as a farmer. There's more to do than to bide and to woo, to try and actually have a romantic and deep emotional connection with the girl. He chooses that actually harvest takes priority. At the end of the stanza, we have a little frightened fair. Now, fair is an anachronistic word, but it means fairy or like a sprite. So she's a little frightened fair, and the alliteration there of the F sound, the fricative F sound, gives you the impression of gentleness. And she seems like a fairy. The simile being used there makes her seem like very gentle and very delicate. In stanza 2, we have the chase of her across the fields. So over the 7-acre field and up across the down, we chased her flying like a hare. The imagery there of her fleeing like a rabbit before hunters, imagining her like an animal being chased down. Before our lanterns, so it's dark and it's cold, so that we can imagine the imagery of the poor girl being chased and dragged back across the fields. She returns in a shiver and a scare. We turned the key upon her fast. She's locked away in the room, and the imagery of that being returned back to this horrific home that she finds herself in and locked up is really quite vivid. In stanza 3, we have the return to what life is like after her escape attempt. We've got, she does the work around the house as well as most, but like a mouse. So we have that sort of the imagery of something that's gentle and again fragile, going to be jumpy and going to be nervous at everything that the farmer does. He mentions that she's happy enough to chat and play with birds and rabbits and such as there. So with animals and with creatures, she seems very at ease, whereas with men, as long as menfolk keep away, not near her eyes beseech. We have that personification of her eyes, almost like screaming to say, "Don't come near me, leave me alone." They say that women say the beasts in stall look around like children at her call. So it's almost like a Snow White type character here, someone who has control of the animals, and they will listen to her and they will respond to her. The fourth stanza we have, shy as a leveret, swift as he, straight and slight as a young larch tree. So we have this idea of like a hare, like a leveret, a young hare, swift and straight and slight as a young larch tree. So actually she's quite dynamic and quite energetic, but not near him. So the energy is immediately lost and the relationship between them is completely broken down. Towards the end of the poem, where we've got stanza 5 and stanza 6, winter is coming into the world, and we see the imagery of the short days shortening, and the oaks are starting to turn brown, the smoke rising in a low grey sky, the leaves are slowly falling down. We have the berries reddening up at Christmas time, so we have that metaphor there for birth and rebirth, if you like, with the berries, and the poet begs, the narrator of the poem begs for what's Christmas time without there be some other in the house than we. So you can imagine where his mind's going with having a child. Now in the final stanza we have the stare betwixt us. We can literally see the juxtaposition, the opposites between them, and how they're separated out. And the narrator breaks down with his exclamations at the end of the soft young down of her, the brown of her eyes, her hair. So we have this emotional, vivid description of her beauty, which breaks him down, and we have that emotional connection at the very, very end where he's realising what he's come to lose. Tonally, there's some really interesting things going on with The Farmer's Bride, looking at different emotions, different feelings of the different characters within there. Obviously, we've got the fear and the distress and the horror of the actual The Farmer's Bride. So we have it described in lots of different animalistic terms, like a leveret, like a hare, like a mouse, like a frightened fear. So we have that fear, her eyes screaming and beseeching and saying, "Not near, not near." So we have this really well developed sense of fear and frustration between the bride and the husband. We also have his frustrations and a lack of understanding, a lack of awareness about how she might feel, and the idea of a romantic relationship rather than just a relationship of convenience. The fact in the very first stanza he says there's more to do at harvest time than bide and woo, tells us everything we need to know about his attitude. We have that sort of predatory nature in the tone of we chased her flying like a hare. The fact that they chased her with lanterns and turned the lock upon her fast and locked her back up in the house. Now, obviously, that's quite significant in terms of his disrespect for her. Tonally, there's also a lamenting tone towards the end of the poem, certainly in that last stanza where we have this desire that's been expressed of the soft brown of her, the down of her eyes, her hair. This exclamation is repeated, and it's giving the sense of the desire that he has for her, but the inability to build that relationship again, and the fear that she still has for him. We have the sort of the incomprehensible nature in the middle, where he can't understand why she'd be so kind and so gentle and so loving and affectionate towards animals, but towards him would show absolutely nothing. So really interesting emotive ideas to get from this. I think it is one of the strongest poems to look at the tone and certainly the different emotions and attitudes of the characters that Charlotte Mew creates within The Farmer's Bride. There's some quite interesting things that are going on structurally and to do with form as well within The Farmer's Bride. The form of the poem is a dramatic monologue where we have the perspective of the farmer. So the use of the first person pronouns of I and we, and the third person pronoun she, gives us a sense that this is a very personal, very emotive poem from the farmer's perspective and the farmer's point of view. Interesting that it's only his voice that we ever get to hear. We never even get to hear the dialogue of from the bride. We only have the eyes that beseech, not near, not near. The fact that she remains nameless within the title is really, really significant. So the fact that we don't even know her name, she remains anonymous, and she remains like that throughout. The rhyme scheme throughout the poem, there is a rhyme scheme, but it's not consistent. It shifts and it varies, and it goes from different points of view. So, for example, the first stanza is A B B A, but then the second stanza has A A B B. So there is a rhyme scheme, but it's a bit all over the place, which might indicate this sense of urgency with the farmer, the sense of chaos and the sense of drama in their relationship. Obviously, it's the rhyme schemes tend to give a sense of completeness and wholeness and a sense of time that people have had to think about things. Now, obviously, the farmer's been married for quite some time, married for at least 3 years, so maybe this is an emotive outburst, but it's something he's had a long time to consider and a long time to think about. So really interesting in terms of structure. Broken apart as well with the incident of her running away within the first 2 stanzas. We have the middle 2 stanzas which focus on the how she behaves now, and the final 2 stanzas which are sort of developing and looking towards the future about what might happen next, and ultimately choosing to end on this exclamation and the sense of despair is very, very important, that the poet chooses to end with the unanswered questions and the lament of the farmer at the very, very end of the poem. There's a range of really interesting language techniques that are used within The Farmer's Bride, the first of which is the semantic field of nature and the natural world. So we see several different comparisons of The Farmer's Bride to different elements of nature, and certainly this idea of the gentle aspects of nature. Described as shy as a leveret, swift as he, we chased her flying like a hare. Even like the description of her like a little frightened fair, like a fairy, is like a natural sprite, like something that would be a part of nature. So we have that natural imagery being used. The use of personal pronouns, the I as the personal address from the farmer, the we as a collective pronoun of the men folk of the town who end up chasing her, and her as a very separate, isolated reference to the farmer's bride herself. The use of naturalistic dialect to make the poem seem more natural and seem more emotive. So the dialect, for example, she runned away, isn't correct, and like "'twasn't a woman." The use of this natural dialect makes it seem like it's more personal and makes it seem more realistic. Potentially the poet's trying to get across that this could be a real situation. Things like repetitions, so throughout the poem there's repetitions of we did this, she did this. So you could look at that as a repetition of this is a situation that's not going to resolve itself. It's cyclical in nature in that sense. We have lots of uses of alliteration. For example, in stanza 4, shy as leveret, swift as he, straight and slight as a young larch tree. The S sound emphasising her gentle nature compared to his more brutal. Rhetorical question at the end of that stanza as well. But what to me? The fact that that remains unanswered is interesting, that it gives the poem lots of questions about where the relationship is going. Likewise, the exclamations at the end of the poem, the narrator being very much frustrated and unanswered in what he's trying to do. So lots of really interesting ideas here, most of which I've covered already in imagery. That will be the main technique that I will be looking at to try and explore the ideas of how the poem is being presented and how the poet is trying to get across the aspects of this relationship. I'll I hope that was a really useful rundown of The Farmer's Bride, looking at some of those core techniques and ideas. Very much like Porphyria's Lover, it's quite a lengthy poem, which gives you a lot of scope to look at a range of different imagery and a range of different ideas here. I like the idea that these are created characters, and the poet is very cleverly manipulating them to show these attitudes and to expose that hypocrisy of Victorian society. So for you to do, obviously, have a look at those 5 strands of meaning, imagery, tone, structure, and language. That's the core basis that we're going to be looking at with any poem. And then a good comparison to consider is look at the idea of possessive and violent relationships with The Farmer's Bride and Porphyria's Lover. So that is a good comparison you might want to consider. So have a look at that, and obviously go back and have a look at the Porphyria's Lover video as well. That'll help you to make those comparisons. Until next time, I hope that you're all staying really, really safe, and take care.